Okay, in the women's autumn rugby test internationals, England in the Red Roses were playing New Zealand in the Black Ferns. The scoreline was surprising, and I was really surprised with how poor the Black Ferns were. The final score was 43 points to 12 in favour of England, and it was the biggest half-time deficit the Black Ferns have ever had at 17-0, and it was a record win for England against New Zealand in women's rugby. So some records broke today. Crowd of nearly 10,000 at Sandy Park in Exeter. Challenging conditions. And yes, this is the first Test match the Black Ferns have played in over 2 years, but the domestic game has been played in New Zealand. So these players are well, match fit and ready, and some of the players had gone to the Olympics as well, so it wasn't as if the New Zealanders haven't been playing rugby. But obviously not playing at Test level for 2 years, combinations, new faces, a delayed World Cup. It means combinations and set plays and working with new teammates, fresh faces in the squad, having a lack of time together. It can have some of an impact. But England had to play with the same conditions, with a challenging wind, and obviously COVID has affected the game in the Northern Hemisphere as well. Yes, England have managed to play, the Six Nations. That's regular test level rugby. The professional club game as well is now gone professional in the women's Premiership 13s. So, yes, domestically higher level, and they have obviously been playing regular test matches as well, which helps with combinations when you're bringing new players into squad. A lot of debutants for both sides today. The first 10 minutes, England started brightly. New Zealand dominated for most of the first 10 minutes. England defended very, very well. And then Abby Ward gets her first of 2 tries in 11 minutes. She follows that up with a second try on 17 minutes. And then New Zealand's, their scrum, their line-out, everything fell apart. But England couldn't capitalise because, the weather conditions. There was a lot of good defence in there by both sides. But the set play for New Zealand was really bad. For a rugby-mad country, that is going to be frustrating for the coaching team. That their set play, the scrum, the line-out, it completely imploded in this game. 4 out of 5 line-outs lost in one period of about 10 minutes. 3 in a row. You just don't normally have that at international level in men's or women's game. The Ellie Kildun try deserved that. She was creating chaos on the England left for the Black Ferns defence on their right channel. They were getting very tight and therefore creating a natural overlap, and they're charging out of the line. Now they're trying to obviously stop the pass, they're trying to go for the intercept or the big hit on the player. They're doing neither. They're coming in tight, and it creates a natural 2 to 3 player overlap, which England haven't had to create themselves. That's the New Zealanders creating that for them, and that created a lot of space in behind. At half time, it's 17-0, record half time deficit for New Zealand. They had moments where they had the ball, but their set play just fell apart. And it didn't rain. It rained before the game. The rain stayed away. There were passing showers in the area, but the wind had an impact. England adapted to it very well. They had no problems in the line-out. New Zealand, their line-out, absolute disaster. Now, the second half, New Zealand showed a bit of life. Alana Bremer gets her try on 44 minutes. And they started very brightly. Think, there could be a comeback here. They did it in the World Cup final in 2017. England would be wary of that. It didn't happen because Bremner herself gets a yellow card for a professional just laying on the ball, basically. A cumulative amount of penalties. New Zealand's discipline wasn't great. Gets a yellow card on 50 minutes. And then the floodgates open with 3 unanswered tries for Davis, Atkinson and Dow. So forwards and backs are just ripping New Zealand to pieces at this point. Now, New Zealand get a second try from Stacey Fleur. He was at the Olympics on 74 minutes. Zoe Harrison gets her try, player of the match. But when they were down to 14 players, they conceded 2 tries. That's where the game was definitely killed off. There were flashes in the second half of the Black Ferns looking like the world champions. But what let them down was their set play and some of their defensive defensive reads, a lot of missed tackles, but they were rushing up in defence, and they weren't doing it as the whole defensive line coming up as one, putting pressure on the passer or the receiver. They were doing it in ones and twos, and they were coming in tight. So the gaps, the manning up is the term, or womaning up in this term, marking your opposition player, lining up who's opposite you. They weren't doing that. They were too close together. They're rushing up individually. So when you have a rush defence, you need to have that section of the defensive line come up as a line at the same pace. They were coming up in ones and twos, and that then created an overlap and disjointed defensive line. Some big collisions in there. There were some very, very big collisions. Really fun watch, to be fair. Yes, it was very blustery. The goal kicking wasn't the best. There was a lot of misconversions, but even in the men's game at the top level, that would have been some very, very difficult kicking conditions. A lot of debutants on both sides. And of course, they do this again next weekend for the second test. New Zealand, I don't think they've not often been in this position. The fact they haven't played for 2 years is one point, but they haven't been in this position where they're so convincingly beaten. I mean, we're talking 31-point differential. That doesn't happen to an All Blacks or a Black Ferns side, be it men's or women's game. That just doesn't happen to them. They don't lose by that margin. It's not part of whatever happens. That's the biggest victory for England over New Zealand in the women's game. Biggest half-time deficit. I think that's actually the biggest deficit I think New Zealand have ever had in a test match in the women's game. This doesn't happen. How they respond next week is going to be very interesting because it'll be their second test. They would have had a full week of training because they're in camp. They need to work on that line-out. They need to work on the scrum. They were dominated in the scrum. And the England scrum is a weakness, as proven by the Six Nations, where France and Italy especially got after the England scrum in the Six Nations and won a lot of ball against their head. New Zealand's scrum was poor, but their line-out was very dysfunctional. And that's something that hindered the Black Ferns in their attempt to win the game. And yes, they got it with the substitutions and bringing on fresh players. That did sort of fix some of the problems. So maybe the lineup that finished the game, maybe the lineup for the Black Ferns that starts the second test next weekend, because those set play problems disappeared when changes were brought on. So that could be something to consider, is rotating some players around, because England didn't have those same problems in the lineup with the wind. They worked out their calls. They had worked out, okay, it's windy, let's do low risk plays. Whereas the Black Ferns were still trying the same plays that weren't working, which I found very surprising, because these are the two best nations in the world in the women's game. But it didn't look like that today. New Zealand did not look like the second best team in the world and world champions. They did not look on the same level as England. And you could argue, yes, disrupted, no test matches. England's domestic game is played at a slightly more professional level. So fitness, and they've had more games together. But New Zealand have had training camps, and they've had a domestic club game that has been played, albeit with obviously COVID restrictions at times. So they have played a lot of rugby. To not play the conditions properly and to have such a dysfunctional set play, you're not going to win games with that. And their discipline was not as good. They gave away more penalties as well, which is another thing that is very surprising with a New Zealand test side. Is discipline is normally key as well. They're normally very well disciplined. They get their skills right. They were forcing passes when they shouldn't have. They overcomplicated things when they shouldn't have. So they were definitely feeling the pressure, and this was an unnatural situation. They're not used to losing. So we'll see what happens in the second test, but well done to the Red Roses of England. Hard luck for the Black Ferns of New Zealand. I'm hoping the second test is closer and more of an end-to-end contest, because England dominated that, and I don't think you can read too much into the fact you're playing a team that hasn't played together for 2 years. So there you go. Thank you very much for watching. Place your thoughts below, and I'll have some more videos for you very, very soon.